Lecture 19, Muhammad, Quran, and Islamic Civilization.
News connected with Islam and Muslims fills the papers every day. Much of it has to do with matters of geopolitics, and it's often linked with conflict. Many Westerners study Islam because of a concern with these matters, and interest in learning about Islam increased dramatically after 9/11. There's always value in wanting to understand another tradition. The downside of doing it for this reason, however, is the association of Islam with current political conflicts, which is only a tiny aspect of the tradition. Throughout its history, Islam has been a tradition of powerful texts and transformative rituals, of great philosophers, mystics, musicians, and scientists, of many schools of law and theology. Learning about the history, beliefs, practices, and texts within the Islamic tradition will provide a much larger context in which to place current events, and this is essential for understanding. So there are a number of reasons to study Islam. First, because of the depth of the tradition itself. It's simply a fascinating religion. Second, it's the second largest religious tradition in the world today. There are around 1.5 billion followers, between 20 and 25% of the world's population. And it's one of the fastest growing religions in the world, and in the United States, where there are between 3 and 7 million Muslims. Third, it's probably one of the most misunderstood religions in the West. What most non-Muslim Westerners know about Islam, they get from the nightly news or newspaper headlines, which tend to focus on conflict and politics. I want to begin by asking you a question. In what region of the world do most Muslims live? Here are your choices. Africa, South Asia, that would include India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, the Middle East, or Southeast Asia, including Indonesia and Malaysia. The right answer is South Asia. But don't be discouraged if you didn't get it right. Whichever answer you gave has some good reasons behind it. Well, many people think it's the Middle East. But in fact, only around 20% of the world's Muslims live in the Arab Middle East, which makes Arabs a small minority among Muslims. So if when you think of a typical Muslim, you think of an Arab, that's inaccurate. In fact, there's no such thing as a typical Muslim, just as there's no such thing as a typical Christian. A Muslim could just as easily come from Jakarta as Cairo, or from Turkey, Bangladesh, China, Bosnia, or Iowa. However, there is a good reason to associate the Middle East, and more specifically the Arabian Peninsula, with Islam. That's its birthplace. And the Arab culture, and especially the language of Arabic, which is the language of the Quran, profoundly shaped Islam. And in addition, most Arabs, but not all, are Muslims. If you said Southeast Asia, that's also a good guess. The largest Muslim-majority country in the world is Indonesia. The population is over 237 million, 86% of whom are Muslim. That's more than all the world's Arab Muslims combined. And if you said Africa, that's also a good guess. There have been Muslims in Africa since the time of Muhammad in the 7th century. And while estimates vary dramatically, there are probably between 370 and 430 million Muslims on the continent at the present time. But no region of the world has more Muslims than South Asia. If you add the Muslim populations of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, you would get approximately 460 million Muslims, or nearly 1/3 of the world's Muslims. One of the things about Islam that I want to emphasize throughout the 3 lectures on the tradition is Islam's remarkable diversity. Whenever anyone starts a sentence with, Muslims think, it's usually too broad of a generalization. What Muslims believe, how they practice, what they value, differs dramatically from one nation and culture to another, and often within each. At the same time, there are certain elements that are shared by virtually all observant Muslims, and I'll highlight these. Before I begin with the life of Muhammad, I want to take a moment to discuss terminology. In Semitic languages, such as Arabic and Hebrew, meaning is often carried by a group of 3 consonants. For example, let's look at the Arabic root sin, lam, mim. That would be SLM in English letters. The word Islam means submission, namely submission to the will of God. A Muslim is one who submits, so it refers to people, while Islam refers to the tradition. Muslim can be a noun or an adjective, so you can say that person is a Muslim or this is a Muslim community. But there is a difference between saying that something is Muslim and saying that it is Islamic. For example, Turkey is a Muslim country. Almost all Turks are Muslims. But it would be misleading to call Turkey, say in the mid-20th century, Islamic, as it was, and to a large degree still is, a secular country. However, we can certainly call Iran Islamic. It's in fact called the Islamic Republic of Iran, because its leaders claim to govern in accordance with Islam. There's one more common usage of that SLM cluster. It also can mean peace, salam. The connection is that the only true peace one can know comes when one submits to the will of God. The most common greeting that Muslims give each other is Assalamu alaikum, meaning peace be upon you. And if you're greeted this way, you can respond Wa alaikum assalam, meaning and unto you peace. In the 6th century, when Muhammad was born, nobody would have thought that the next great world empire would come from the Arabian Peninsula. Bordered by 3 seas, without major cities, and surrounded by 2 large empires, the Persian Sassanid Empire to the east and the Christian Byzantine Empire to the west, the Arabian Peninsula was seen by the people of these ancient civilizations primarily as a way to transport goods from one part of the world to the other. While there were settled urban communities, much of the population consisted of Bedouins, nomadic tribes that traveled in camel caravans. The tribal character was a key feature of life. People were very loyal to their own tribes, but there was no unifying ideology that brought all the tribes together. There were frequent raids conducted among tribes. People lived by a code of revenge and honor, where an offense against any member of the tribe had to be avenged. Another important feature of pre-Islamic Arabia was the emphasis on the spoken word and the value of eloquence. Poetry was highly valued, and bards sang of the history of the tribe, preserving the tradition through poetry. The religion of the time was largely polytheistic, and various deities were associated with natural forces, localities, and tribes. The icons for these deities were kept in a cube-shaped sanctuary known as the Kaaba in the city of Mecca, present-day Saudi Arabia, which was a pilgrimage destination. Jews and Christians also lived on the peninsula, so monotheism was known in the region, and some Arabs believed in a high god in addition to the tribal and nature deities. It was into this world that Muhammad was born. He was born in 570 in Mecca and was orphaned at an early age. In his 20s, he began to work in the caravan business for a widow named Khadija, and he did very well for her. According to tradition, Muhammad was illiterate, but he possessed excellent judgment and good skills with people. Muhammad and Khadija fell in love, and when he was 25 and she was 40, they married. They had sons who died in infancy, and daughters, including Fatima, who would become an important figure. He had a monogamous marriage with Khadija for 24 years until her death. Muhammad was said to be a contemplative man, and he would frequently spend time in meditation in the caves around Mecca. One day, in the year 610, in the month of Ramadan, when Muhammad was 40, his life, and subsequently the world, changed. While in a cave, he was visited by a presence that was understood to be the angel Gabriel. He was told to recite, Iqra. He responded, I cannot. I'm unlettered. And then the words started to pour out of him. This was the beginning of the revelation of the Quran, which itself means recitation or reading. And the revelations would continue over the next 22 years. When he received these revelations, he'd be transformed. He would sweat heavily from what he called the weight of the message. He would sometimes hear bells ringing or enter into a trance state. The revelation itself was oral, and Muhammad would dictate it to others, who then committed it to memory and sometimes to writing. Only later would all of the fragments of revelation be assembled and compiled into the text we now know as the Quran. Eventually, Muhammad began to deliver the message of the one God to the larger community in Mecca, where he met tremendous resistance, not only for religious and economic reasons, but also due to tribal cultural values that saw submission, which is an essential component of Islam, as a form of weakness. Muhammad faced not only rejection and even boycotts from Meccans, but also assassination attempts. In the year 619, he lost both his beloved wife Khadija and his uncle, who had acted as his protector after his parents died. At this moment in his life, the persecuted and beleaguered Muhammad had a profound spiritual experience that would lift him up: his night journey from Mecca to Jerusalem. According to the tradition, he traveled on a flying steed from Mecca to Jerusalem in one night. That's a journey that usually took around a month. And when there, he met earlier prophets, he prayed with them, and then ascended into the heavens where he had an encounter with God. This encounter both educated him, he learned the proper form of prayer, and inspired him. Some Muslims see this as a literal physical journey, and others see it as an inward spiritual journey that took place outside of time. Muhammad's reputation for integrity and fairness reached the city of Yathrib, 280 miles north of Mecca, where a number of tribes were engaged in conflict. So they invited him there to help settle the disputes. And Muhammad saw this as an ideal opportunity to escape the difficulties of Mecca. So he and his followers moved to Yathrib, which would become known as Madinat al-Nabi, the city of the Prophet, or Medina, thereafter. This journey, which took place in 622, is known as the Hijra, the emigration, and it's from this moment that the Islamic calendar is dated. When you see a year given in an Islamic calendar, you'll often see the Western year followed by another year with the letters AH next to it. And this stands for in the year of the Hijra. Now, this can't be calculated simply by subtracting 622 from the Western year, as the Islamic calendar is lunar and it's not adjusted to the solar calendar. After Muhammad's arrival in Medina, there was what became understood as a golden age of Islam, as there was a religio-political community led by Muhammad as both a prophet and a temporal leader. Many Muslims still look back to this golden age as an example to be followed for all time. A community of Muslims was beginning to take shape, but it was a community that would be born in war. There was a series of battles between the Muslims and the Meccans in the ensuing years. And in the early battles, the Muslims were vastly outnumbered. But the Muslims won. And despite some setbacks, their successes continued, which they interpreted as a sign of God's favor. In 630, Muhammad assembled 10,000 followers and bloodlessly took Mecca. In a powerful symbolic moment, after his successful entry into Mecca, Muhammad went to the Kaaba and smashed the idols, rededicating the Kaaba to God, as it was believed that it was originally built by Abraham to honor God before becoming a location for idols. By the time of Muhammad's death in 632, nearly all of Arabia followed Islam. After hearing news of Muhammad's death, one of his followers said, "The Prophet is not dead," and he promised that Muhammad would return. Another one of Muhammad's companions, the man who would succeed him as community leader and become caliph, proclaimed that Muhammad was a mere mortal and is now dead, but God is eternal. The Quran emphasizes that Muhammad, like all prophets, is just a human being and must not be worshipped. All worship must be directed to God alone, which is why the earlier Western practice of calling this tradition Mohammedanism is deeply misguided. Muhammad died and was buried in Medina, with a mosque built around his grave. Medina is the second most important pilgrimage site in Islam after Mecca. Although Muhammad is seen as mortal, he's seen as the ideal person, the living expression of God's will. He's sometimes called the living Quran, as his life exemplifies what it is to be a true Muslim, a true submitter to the will of God. Whenever his name is said, observant Muslims say, aloud or silently, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, may the peace of God be upon him. Phrases like this are also put after the names of other prophets. So if you're reading about Muhammad and his name is followed by the letters P-B-U-H, this means peace be upon him. As I mentioned earlier, Muhammad's message met with a great deal of resistance. Why then did more and more people join him? Why did they believe that this man, an illiterate merchant, was a prophet of God? One of the main reasons is the Quran itself. Arabs, you'll recall, greatly valued the spoken word and beautifully crafted poetry. When they heard the powerful words come from Muhammad's mouth with sophisticated verse structures and rhyme schemes, it was impossible for them to believe that he was creating these words spontaneously. A native Arabic-speaking Muslim once said to me, it would be as if the works of Shakespeare had suddenly come fully formed from the mouth of an illiterate man. However, it's important to remember that for Muslims, the Quran is not poetry. It's revelation. But it certainly has features that are poetic. This is not something you can understand if you only read the Quran in translation. And in fact, Muslims have a very different view of translation than Christians do. In Christianity, there's an emphasis placed on translating the Bible into as many languages as possible so that people around the world can read it. For Muslims, it would be much better for people to learn Arabic and read, chant, and hear the Quran in its original language. They'll emphasize that a translation of the Quran is not the Quran. God's words were in Arabic, and they can only be fully experienced in Arabic. While most Muslims in the world are not native Arabic speakers and cannot speak conversational Arabic, they learn to pray in Arabic and hear the call to prayer and Quranic chanting in Arabic. The Quran consists of 114 chapters, which are called surahs. That means fence or enclosure. It's approximately the size of the New Testament. The surahs are arranged generally in order of decreasing length, starting with the second surah. The first is an introductory surah. The longest surah has 6,100 words, the shortest has 10. Each surah is divided into passages, which are called ayahs. Ayah means sign, which means that each passage is considered a sign from God. The surahs are divided in a number of ways based on when and where they were revealed. So there are early and late surahs, there are Meccan and Medinan surahs. The Quran contains many themes and genres: theological passages, laws for how to eat, do business, and conduct family life, narratives covering the time from Adam through Abraham to Jesus, and beautiful poetic imagery. Through all of this, there is one theme that emerges more strongly than any: Tawheed, the oneness of God. Muslims are profoundly monotheistic. The oneness of God means the oneness of creation. All of us are related to each other. No longer would people be connected through tribal loyalty, but rather through submission to the one God. And oneness also meant that life should be one, for God's domain extends to all areas. For many Muslims, life can't be divided into secular and sacred spheres. We shouldn't be centered on God one day a week and then return to our everyday secular lives for the other 6. Every aspect of life, family, economics, politics, and so on must accord with the will of God. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that the state should be in the business of enforcing their interpretation of God's will. Muslims differ strongly on that question. The life of a devout Muslim centers on God. Many Muslims begin speeches or writing with the words, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. In Islam, God must not be represented. In fact, in some forms of Islam, even human figures, especially prophets, should not be represented, as God alone creates forms, and our attention should be on God, not on created images. The highest form of Islamic art is calligraphy, the beautification of the word, particularly passages from the Quran. As Tawheed is the most important theme, the greatest sin is its opposite, shirk. Some people translate shirk as polytheism, and it certainly includes this meaning, but it goes beyond this. Shirk means something like associationalism, or associating anything with God. It's putting something else on the same level with God. This doesn't just mean a tribal deity or a nature spirit. It can also mean money, or power, or fame. Shirk is considered the only unforgivable sin in Islam. The Quran emphasizes God's mercy, saying that God can forgive anything if a person genuinely repents and seeks mercy, except for shirk. There's a strong emphasis on Judgment Day in Islam, when each person will stand before God to answer for all of his or her deeds. Muslims believe in bodily resurrection, and there are vivid descriptions within the tradition of heaven and hell. Another Quranic theme is the connection of the revelation to Muhammad with the revelations to earlier prophets. This is an essential point. To Muslims, the God they worship is the same God worshipped by Jews and Christians. Muslims use the word Allah to refer to God. It's important to understand that this doesn't refer to a name of God as if it were a proper name. Rather, Allah simply means the God, the one God. So when Arabic-speaking Jews or Christians pray to God, they'll use the same word. Muslims also speak of the 99 most beautiful names of God, and these are attributes such as justice, mercy, and compassion. Muslims believe that earlier prophets, including Adam, Abraham, Moses, John the Baptist, Jesus, and others, were genuine prophets of God. Those prophets who brought with them a scripture, such as Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, are considered messengers of God. All prophets are considered human beings who are sent as reminders of God's oneness and dominion. In fact, Muhammad emphasized that he was not bringing a new religion to the people. Rather, he was teaching the oldest religion of humankind, the original religion that was forgotten. So Muslims see the revelations of Judaism and Christianity as authentic reminders from God, along with the Quran. However, for Muslims, the Quran is the only perfect revelation, as human involvement in the Torah and New Testament over time brought errors into those texts. Islam has many connections with Judaism and Christianity other than the shared belief in one God and many of the same prophets. Judaism and Islam share a common ancestor, Abraham. However, whereas the Jewish line goes through Isaac, who's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Muslim line goes through Abraham's first son, the one he had with Hagar, Ishmael. There are many connections with Christianity as well. Jesus is one of the most frequently discussed prophets in the Quran. Muslims believe that Jesus was born of a virgin, Maryam, and that he healed and worked miracles, and that he'll return at the end times. However, and this is very important, Muslims do not believe that Jesus is divine or has any special status as God's son. Therefore, Muslims do not believe in the Trinity, for they believe that that compromises the unity of God. Despite the differences, Muslims consider Jews and Christians to be fellow peoples of the book. And the Quran states that Jews and Christians, like Muslims, have the potential to receive God's favor and attain paradise at death. The Quran states that Muslims, Jews, and Christians, quote, "Whoever believes in God and the last day, and whosoever does right, shall have his reward with his Lord, and will neither have fear nor regret." The Quran sometimes lays out specific rules that must be followed. Some of these deal with diet. You might have heard the phrase halal food. Halal simply means permitted. The opposite is haram, or forbidden. The Quran forbids the consumption of alcohol, pork, and any meat that is not slaughtered in a ritually required way. In order to be considered halal meat, an animal must be killed in the name of God. The butcher must dedicate the animal to God upon killing it, and it must be killed quickly with a cut to the carotid artery. There are also specific rules regarding women. There's been much discussion about whether Islam is empowering or oppressive to women. While one can argue that the Quran doesn't give women all the rights that they've achieved in the last century in the West, it's clear that in many ways, this 7th century text empowered women in remarkable ways for its time, and in some cases in ways that weren't equaled in Europe for centuries afterward. It was a tremendous advance in women's status over what had existed previously in the Arab world. For example, women gained the right to a share of inheritance, to initiate a divorce proceeding, to retain their own property in marriage, and to testify in a legal proceeding. The number of wives a man could have was limited to 4. Before this, it was unlimited, and multiple wives would be only allowed if equal treatment was assured. Most Muslims today are monogamous, and some see polygamy as permitted only during the early period when there were many widows and orphans who needed families. One of the biggest debates has been over the issue of women's covering, wearing what's called a hijab in Arabic. If you look around the Muslim world, you'll see all kinds of coverings, from colorful scarves around the back part of the head to full black head-to-toe coverings. The Quran provides no details on what appropriate attire for women is. It just emphasizes the need for modesty. The differences that you see are entirely cultural and sometimes political. Women who cover do so only in public or when they're among men outside of their family members. Keep in mind, Muslims are certainly not the only people to cover. Jews and Christians have traditionally covered in many cultural contexts, and it's likely that most of the images of the Virgin Mary that you've seen show her covered. Second, in the vast majority of Muslim countries, covering is not mandatory. It's a woman's choice. And in fact, in Turkey, there have been recent periods where women who covered were not allowed into public educational institutions, as the strongly secular governments of the past wanted to keep the influence of Islam out of the public sphere. Only in more conservative countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran is covering required. While the Quran is the most important source of guidance and authority in Islam, there's another important source: the actions and words of the Prophet Muhammad, known as the Sunnah, meaning a path or road. Since Muhammad lived life fully in accordance with God's will, his actions can serve as examples to others. The Quran itself states, obey God, obey the Prophet. The majority branch of Islam, Sunni, takes its name from the Sunnah, so those who follow this path. There are not that many details about Muhammad's life and actions found in the Quran itself. The Quran is not about Muhammad in the way that the New Testament is about Jesus. For accounts of Muhammad, one consults the Hadith, reports about Muhammad's words and deeds. Hadith are not revealed, as Muslims believe the Quran was. They were remembered by people who were with Muhammad and then passed down orally before being written down. Within a century or so after Muhammad's death, the number of hadith exceeded 100,000. So scholars developed a science of hadith authentication to evaluate the reliability of the reports. Those hadith that were judged sound were collected in large volumes, and these were regularly consulted. Muslims can now buy large hadith collections on CD-ROMs and conduct searches by topic. Islam began with the revelation to one man, and then spread as he shared the revelation and drew followers. At the time of Muhammad's death, there were no written scriptures, no law, and no established institutions. And then, through a series of remarkable triumphs, Muslims established a far-reaching empire in an astonishingly short amount of time. Within a century of Muhammad's death, they had already triumphed over both the Byzantine and the Persian empires, and they held a territory that stretched from the south of France and Spain to North Africa to the Indus River in South Asia. At its height, it would become the most advanced culture in the world, enabling the flourishing of philosophy, science, math, art, architecture, and engineering. While people in the West now see Baghdad as war-torn and characterized by conflict, from the 8th to the 13th centuries, it was one of the greatest cities on earth, along with Cordoba in Muslim Spain. In Baghdad, Muslim scholars preserved and translated ancient Greek and Roman texts, which were condemned and neglected during the Dark Ages in Christian Europe, thus enabling classical philosophy to survive, paving the way for the European Renaissance. Reflect on the debt we owe to the thinkers of this time and place. Arabic numerals, for one thing. Can you imagine doing complex math with Roman numerals? Algebra, an Arabic word. Developments in medicine, gains in optics and hygiene, the creation of teaching hospitals. And during this period, the Islamic law schools developed. As Islam spread to all parts of the world, many diverse forms arose. Within the remarkable variety, there are practices that virtually all Muslims share. These bring unity to the worldwide Muslim community. Examining these practices, as we'll do in the next lecture, is essential to understanding Islam.